Okay. Please forgive any background noise. This is a very noisy time of day. So it's been a fun day, though. I don't know. I watched Drive My Car earlier. At the time of recording, it's up for Oscar stuff. Who knows how it's going to perform there? But it's actually pretty darn good. It's really long. It's very slow pacing. So if you're not used to that, you might have some difficulty there. But I think, it's actually pretty darn good. I really enjoyed it. Anyway, what we're here to talk about today is just a hypothetical. This is not an accusation. I'm not sure how confrontational the title of this video is going to be because I haven't thunk that up yet. But the basic question here that I'm asking myself, and I'm also asking you, the person who happened to click on this video, do you think that Disney/Pixar, in terms of their feature film work, do you think that they might be starting to stagnate a bit? Not overall, specifically when it comes to the visuals of their movies. This might come across like sort of a strange question, just in general, and specifically coming from me, because certainly in recent memory, whenever I've talked about Disney movies and Pixar movies, new releases, specifically when I was talking about Encanto and Turning Red, I made a real point of saying, despite some other criticisms that I had, that was a separate category, when I talked about the visuals of each one of those movies, I just said, okay, look, it's Disney/Pixar, respectively, and you really can't say too many negative things about the visuals of these movies just because it's so clearly polished and sometimes inspired and just incredibly pleasant to look at 100% of the time. There is definitely a certain amount of creativity there. They've obviously attracted some of the flat-out top-level talent in those areas for animation, modeling, effects, concept art, storyboard artists, all of that. These are incredibly skilled people, and nothing that I say throughout the rest of the video is meant to detract from that. And I think it would be silly to try to come in here and be all contrary and just say, oh, you know what, they're not that great. They're not that great. The visuals have never been that great. No, that's just not really true. And even the recent movies, Luca looked fantastic, and Encanto, well, the art direction overall is really not a favorite of mine. Character models I kind of hated, especially for someone like me who doesn't have a strong background in visual arts. I can't say too many bad things other than just, oh, it's not necessarily my taste. And then Turning Red. Turning Red had a bunch of plus points for me, specifically in the fact that the early part of the movie includes this cartooniness, I guess I have to say, just the way the characters are posed, movement, unrealistic, exaggerated elements. There's a ton of that. For some reason, only in the early part of the movie. I don't know why it's not there later. Maybe they figured it would kind of distract from the more serious story stuff going on. Anyway, so that's positive, and that's definitely not something that I can remember seeing in almost any other Pixar movie, especially in the early days. The wow factor came from the fact that, oh, it's full CG, art direction is fantastic, look, everything looks beautiful, lighting is great, it looks like they're using real cameras, all this great stuff. But they were never really going crazy in terms of creative movement and animation, all that kind of stuff. But here in Turning Red, no, it's there. It's there quite a bit. I really respect that. I really enjoy that aspect of the movie. But here's the thing, and this was the catalyst for this idea and wanting to make this video at all, is that I saw the trailer for Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. And I already made a whole video about how much I love that trailer and just my sort of visceral response to it. So go ahead and take a look. But to sum up, wow, am I into the visuals of that movie, both in terms of actual movement and animation and just background art. I think that movie looks fantastic just from the small amount that we've seen of it so far. The story doesn't seem all that great. Nothing else about it seems especially innovative or interesting. It's going to be a Puss in Boots movie, and hopefully the other aspects are great, the performances and the writing and everything else. But I at least know that just watching it, I'm going to have a lovely time looking at all the backgrounds, looking at how they handle color and lighting, and all that wonderful stuff. Now, I don't want to give the impression that that movie's art direction is like the objective best. I mean, for one thing, this is all subjective to begin with, but also it's a very drastic shift away from some of the art direction we see in Disney Pixar stuff, and it also seems just like a great choice specifically for this movie, because they're certainly taking inspiration from Spain in the Puss in Boots movies, and I'm not gonna go around and say, oh, you know what, every other art director in the industry working on an animated feature for a major studio should use a similar look and like clearly painted backgrounds with really visible brush strokes and all this. No, it doesn't fit everything. But if we make our perspective on that art direction a little bit less specific, then we can see that it is a very clear instance or potentially evolution of this seeming consistent progression towards the integration of 3D models and environments that we've been seeing in animated feature films for decades now, and then 2D art, whether it's painting or sketching or just illustration in general. They're coming together, at least for some of these really massive studio films that have garnered a huge amount of positive critical reception, and also I think they've made a decent amount of money. Spider-Verse is definitely top of the list here in terms of like a go-to example of how this style has sort of danced its way into the mainstream. That movie won the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. I definitely agree with that choice. It's absolutely stunning to look at, just to experience, and in particular seeing that movie in the theater was insane. It was almost just too much visual information at times, but ultimately I was like, wow, I'm just blown away. I wasn't even paying attention to specifics. It was just the overall feel, the gestalt of it being like, wow, they did a great job. I've never seen anything that looks quite like that. And then after the fact, when you research more and more, you're like, oh, okay, here are the specifics, here are the specific techniques they're using, here was their inspiration, here's how they incorporated, you know, these elements of newsprint and comic books and famous comic book artists, all these different things, and it was pulled off so well. Now, that's not exclusive, as I mentioned in I think the Puss in Boots video. Another integration of just like 2D art and 3D characters and environments was in that Paper Man short, which was I forget if it was Disney or Pixar, I'll check up on it again, but either way, coming from the big boys that we're talking about in this video, and it looked fantastic. That also got a ton of positive attention at the time it was released. What else? The Bad Guys coming out from DreamWorks. That's clearly taking some similar notes where certain freeze frames or just action bits, you have just line work. It just looks like either pencil or pen lines on top of our 3D characters and environments. So this is a thing. This is very much a thing. I'll let other people try to suss out what was the real turning point to bring this towards the mainstream. I definitely think the movies and shorts I've talked about here played a large role in that, but at this point, it's really hard to deny that it's a thing in Western animation right now, specifically from some of the largest and highest earning movie studios on the planet. Going from even just those trailers of those other movies or rewatching Spider-Verse, and then going back, I recently rewatched Turning Red just the other day, and I also rewatched bits of Encanto, and for both of those, I felt underwhelmed, like severely so, on the visual level. Now, in Turning Red, I've already mentioned I love the cartooniness in terms of movement and stuff, but visually, and again, I'm not trying to detract from the incredible amount of work that went into it and how good it does really look, but that edge, that newness, that novelty, that inventiveness is not quite there in terms of just art direction and execution, how it all comes together in the end. Okay, so there's a risk here, right? There's a risk of looking at this flashy new animation approach, because it's not just one cohesive style that we've seen across all those other movies I just mentioned. It's being adapted in different ways, which is great. That's how new styles and approaches emerge, right? It takes time, people have different takes on them. It could be that this is just sort of a trendy thing. Trendy, it's sort of a dirty word in this context, right? It makes you think, oh, it's something that will be popular for a short amount of time, and then it goes away, and it even dates movies that really latched onto that because it's like, oh yeah, we hate that now. But I don't know if that's the case with what we're seeing here in the integration of 2D visual arts. And this is a tough line. It's tough to distinguish these two from each other a lot of the time, especially in the moment. In retrospect, it's much more clear, but like the difference between a trend and a genuine innovation that pushes pushes things forward, it can be tough to tell the difference. It can be tough to tell the difference until years later you can look back and say, it's very clear that this led to that. Gotcha. But here, just on intuition alone, I don't feel like this is a flash in the pan kind of thing. I don't feel like this is just a bunch of major studios and art teams just saying, oh, well, hey, that was successful. Spider-Verse won an Oscar. Why don't we try to do something sort of like that? That's very clearly visually different. Take some notes from that style of animation, fewer frames of movement in certain scenes, stuff like that. I don't get that impression at all. And just based on the sheer level of enjoyment, the amount of joy that I feel in my heart when I see something like that, and it feels so different and it feels so fresh, that kind of makes me think this is just a genuine evolution of specifically 3D animation. It's been around for what, close to 30 years now in terms of feature films. Just seeing 3D models and 3D environments, no matter how well they're textured, no matter how clean and polished everything looks, no matter how vibrant and saturated the colors they throw at you on the screen, just that element alone is starting to get old. And I think that's what I'm noticing. If you think of the Pixar movies of the last 10 years, and you know what? I'm going to help you out. I'm going to give you a list. All right? Okay, so just from, let's say, just from 2012 on. So we have Brave, we got Monsters University, we have Inside Out, The Good Dinosaur. Did I ever watch that one? Finding Dory, Cars 3, Coco, Incredibles 2, Toy Story 4, Onward, Soul, Luca, and Turning Red. Now, specifically these movies that happen to take place in more or less the real world. So that would include stuff like Finding Dory, technically, Coco, half and half, I'll say, Incredibles 2, Toy Story 4, Soul, Luca, and Turning Red. I would think all of those more or less take place in the real world, and we get generally realistic environments with some kind of crazy twist because it's a wacky animated movie. Between those, I'm sure that if we did side-by-side comparisons of screenshots, yes, there are clear differences. Yes, they have strong art direction. Good job, teams. They made wonderful looking movies. But do you feel like any one of these pushed things forward, visually speaking? We're not talking about storytelling. I'll talk about that in a bit. Do you think any of those movies felt like they just completely blew you away, specifically in terms of visuals and not in terms of story stuff, representation, etc.? Clearly, there have been some advances there as well. And my answer is no. And I would even say that a lot of those movies, in terms of their visual identities, just sort of blend together for me to the point where I have a hard time thinking what the big look was, like what the what the hook was, visually speaking, what the inspirations were. For a lot of those, I just feel like, oh yeah, that was another one that I watched and I moved on with my life, and I didn't get screen caps and use them as my wallpaper on my computer. Like I wasn't inspired by these on the visual side of things. And that's where I start to get a little bit worried. Okay, because here's how I interpret this situation. Here's how I interpret like the roots of potential stagnation in the visual department for major movie studios, specifically with Disney and Pixar. I credit that potential stagnation to risk aversion. It's sticking to what has already worked, maybe with tiny little tweaks to make it sort of different from what has come before, but it's not making any leaps and bounds. It's not blowing anyone's minds visually. Now, if we're just talking about Disney, trying to criticize Disney for being risk averse is valid. It's a valid thing, and I think we should continue to do it in general. It's not going to work. Like, especially the Bob Iger era of Disney has been the least risk-taking Disney era possibly of all time. They're sticking to the course. They know what works. They know what people tend to respond to. Audiences don't seem to be clamoring for anything all that new. They'll keep buying tickets to the stuff that feels like the thing they saw before. Fine, got it. But then if we move things over to Pixar, risk, novelty, innovation, ingenuity, creativity, those, for me, are at the core of what Pixar was founded on. That was the first time that a fully, CG animated feature film was huge. Toy Story blew the doors off the industry. It immediately became a huge, huge thing. And for decades, or at least least 10, 15 years. They stayed at the absolute top of that segment. It was just home run after home run, not only in terms of hard-hitting, emotional, impactful stories, but also visuals were improving quite a bit. They were making big strides, and it was working incredibly well. And to feel now this little twinge around my shoulder that, what if Pixar doesn't want to do that anymore? And that's really what it comes down to is the desire, I guess, because I am not in a million years questioning the ability of Pixar's current, massive team to do something really cool and innovative, visually speaking. They've got the talent a million times over. The Pixar shorts are very clear evidence that they can do new things in terms of story and visual. But I don't know, maybe that's not part of the business plan. You know what I mean? Maybe they don't see that as a priority to come around and say, everything, we really need to push things forward. Or at least, how about this? Just like one a year, because they've been doing multiples per year for a good while now. Why can't just like one of those be a little bit risky? Why can't just one of those be a little bit bolder, just in terms of visuals? They can stick to their awful story formula that they've had since day one. That's another topic. But come on, let people take chances. Let people do something genuinely interesting and different. Like I said, it's kind of there in Turning Red, but only for a little while, and then it just feels like ho-hum, here we are again, here is the story, and then the family conflict, and now it's over. Am I actually just being crazy here? Am I seeing something that's just not there? Wow, I need a break. It's so hot under here. Oh my god. Sorry, we're taking a little break to get some water. Oh my goodness. Oh, it's so hot. Why is it so hot? I was talking to the landlord earlier, and they were like, oh, you know what? We might have to. They're trying to fix a leak somewhere in the building. So she's like, hey, the plumbing guys, they might need to, knock out an entire wall of your bathroom, by the bathtub and everything, to try to fix this. And I was like, that could actually be kind of inconvenient. I really hope they don't. I don't want to have a big hole. I don't want to have people here all the time. This is where how am I going to record with a big hole in the wall, and then the cat's going to try to get in the wall? Oh my god. Okay, let's get back to it. Okay, so in an effort to close this out, because I really do need to stop, because, oh boy, the editing job on this is going to be a whole thing. So my last thing here, my interpretation, as I mentioned earlier, is that the core of this lack of visual innovation and interest and creativity is just risk aversion. Yeah, you can do whatever you want within clear boundaries. It's a big studio thing. It's a massive financial investment. Of course, they want it to be relatively safe. The safer, the better. I get it. But here's the thing. Creativity and innovation and visuals and filmmaking, those are not just things to satisfy people who really like filmmaking. It's not just for visual artists to feel like, ooh, I'm doing something, I'm doing good work. And those are all wonderful benefits of visual innovation, but it's also a financial consideration in the long term. This is a big topic in general, is how plenty of big companies, especially in certain industries, really focus way too much on short-term gains, and that results in some moves that are going to cause major harm in the long term, which is bad on every account. You're going to lose money in the long term. You might just ruin the whole business. All kinds of horrible consequences of doing that. And I think that applies here too. We're like, yes, for the moment, yeah, okay, we'll spend $250 million to $300 million on this movie. It's going to be very safe in its visuals, its storytelling, etc. It'll make a predictable amount of money. It might even make up to $1 billion. Cool. We've made a decent amount of profit. We can just keep doing this and never think of the future. It's fine. That has a limit. Because people, I honestly think, even just general audiences, will start to notice the gap between the folks who have been doing more or less the same thing for 15, 20 years and the folks who are turning out genuinely stunning movies that look fantastic and also deliver on every other element. It's gonna come back to bite them unless something really changes there. I don't know if it's a leadership thing. I don't know if it comes down to individual art directors. I have no idea. But this is a long-term business thing. It's not just about creativity. It's not just about artistry, feeding the soul. Even if all you care about is money, it is an issue It's an issue if you don't consider how these decisions will work out in the distant long-term future. And a comparison that I think really works here comes from Mr. Iwata, the former head of Nintendo Worldwide. He sadly passed in 2015, something like that. He has this incredibly famous GDC talk from early 2000s. There's this wonderful segment at the beginning where he's just looking at super big picture stuff for the entire video game industry. And he's saying okay, here's where we are now. Here's where we were 20 years ago. Let's be honest and try to see where things are headed, because if we're not looking to the future, we will end up getting stuck in the present, which then becomes the past. Isn't that fun how that works out?
We are smaller in the amount of risk we are willing to accept. We are also smaller in how we define video games. The list of genres seems fixed. The racing tracks, the soundtracks, the bosses, the heroes are starting to looking more and more alike.
And there's a specific moment where he's talking about how, right now, yes, games look better all the time. And we're pouring more money into them. We're hiring more people to pull this stuff off. More people are buying games, so the cost is justified, and incredible advances, right? Character models look fantastic, higher poly stuff, fantastic environments, start moving into the open world environments, really huge game worlds. All that's great. But at one point in the speech, he says something along the lines of, at some point, our games aren't going to look any better. So what do we do then?
We are even getting smaller in how we define progress. Making games look more photorealistic is not the only means of improving the game experience.
And I think that is just fantastic. That's not some kind of sage advice. It's just a very reasonable perspective of what's going to play out in the future. And applies here too, because we've had a very similar trajectory with fully CG animated feature films. Yeah, at first we were making massive leaps and bounds in terms of how good they look, and oh wow, this is basically photorealistic at this point. Crazy impressive. Wow, that's wonderful. And then we get desensitized to it. This has been a thing with CG effects in general for a long time. It's definitely a thing with, as I'm demonstrating by talking about this for half an hour, it's becoming a thing with the animated CG movies too, where I can only be impressed by those advances for a little while. If it doesn't continue to evolve, shrug, who cares? It's not happening a whole lot visibly within Disney and Pixar. A little less surprising for Disney, a little more surprising for Pixar, but in both cases, I think that's going to end up being an issue. And who knows, maybe we'll see it soon. Maybe the next giant Pixar movie they announce will have this incredible look and will clearly be taking some kind of nods from this integration of 2D illustration and artwork. Maybe not. Maybe they're just going to keep doing this to really close things out once and for all. I think the most surprising element of this whole discussion for me has been that initial question. The fact that I'm even asking whether or not Disney and Pixar are starting to lag behind the rest of the industry would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. It would have been unthinkable to me a month ago. And all of a sudden, I am asking this question very legitimately. That might be some kind of tip-off to some potential trouble here if they don't honestly contribute to pushing things forward in bigger ways, not just the minor tweaks, not just slightly perfecting photorealistic environments and fake cameras and all that stuff. It's great. It's all very positive. Again, the people working at these places are phenomenally skilled people. It's starting to not be enough, and I'm kind of concerned by that. And I guess that's why I was inspired to make the video. I'm so tired of talking. It really gets something out of me. I live alone. I don't talk this much. I don't talk this much in my day-to-day life. This is an event. This is an athletic performance. We're done for today. I certainly want to talk about this. Feel free to talk about it in the comments. I don't know if I'll show up there, but streams and stuff, we can talk about it anywhere else. Ask your friends. Ask your friend who works at Pixar as an art director what the deal is. What leadership's doing, or what's going on. That's all for me. Thanks for stopping by.